Hello, folks, and welcome to a ConsultWebs webinar. Today, we've got some exciting information to share, specifically about closing the gap in your legal marketing. And so, what's that gap? Ultimately, there are a lot of law firms out there consistently trying to get better. And the first thing to do to get better is ultimately identify what you're doing wrong or where your weaknesses lie. Today, I want to cover some practical steps to consider to identify those weaknesses first and foremost, but provide you with practical tips that's proven based on facts and data on how you can ultimately fill those gaps, make your firm stronger, and ultimately make better decisions in your marketing. So let's dive in. The first thing we want to cover is ultimately what the three core components are that we see as important to ultimately identifying where those gaps lie. And so ultimately, measurement, investment, and confidence, we believe, are the three keys to identifying that gap. So let's start with the problem. There's a gap between where we want our marketing to be and what the reality is. And a perfect example of this, all too often law firms have this just glamorous vision for what their marketing is or who their brand ultimately portrays. And in many instances, that is far from what the public ultimately identifies as your brand or who you are as a law firm. So you have to understand that there is often a disconnect between your dreams or your vision for marketing and what the reality is. All too often, we see law firm websites that essentially look the same, feel the same, and say the same things your competitors are saying with their websites. There's absolutely no differentiation. That's a huge problem. It's a huge weakness for law firms because ultimately people are looking to be compelled. They're coming to your website to identify specifically what makes you different, but not just that. Ultimately, what makes you different and why is that ultimately going to be better for them, the consumer, the potential client? You want to be able to tell why you are unique and how that relates to the user. And all too often, we get caught up in saying essentially the same thing that everyone else is saying: trusted, experienced, credible, established for a long time or for a certain period of time. It's all the same thing, it's all off the shelf. So, how can you bridge that gap? How can you ultimately go beyond what everyone else is saying and illustrate that true differentiator? It comes down to these three keys, as mentioned earlier: measurement, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but specifically evaluating results and having very specific data that you're looking at month in and month out to determine what's working and what's not. The next piece comes down to the investments, and not just how much, but where you're allocating those dollars, where dollars are being applied month in, month out, particularly between your brand and building your brand against sales activation and driving leads immediately, looking more for short-term results. And then the last piece, which all kind of brings all these together, is the concept of confidence or lack thereof. All too often, firms are hesitant to make big important decisions for their business, for their marketing, because there's a lack of confidence. We'll dig into that a little bit further, but we believe those are the critical areas on where the gaps lie with law firms today, especially those advertising online. So, what can you do to close that gap? Well, the first thing, as mentioned, is knowing what you're missing. And that's where it comes into measurement. What's interesting, we have a podcast, Lawsome, the podcast. There's the shameless plug for it. If you haven't heard it, it's one of the most entertaining value add loss or podcasts, awesome podcasts in the industry today. I encourage you to check it out. But we have a great following on social, and we surveyed a number of law firms throughout the country, specifically asking them, do you know what the cost per lead is in your law firm? And astoundingly, the majority voted against yes. Interestingly enough, 36% said no. They have no idea what the cost per lead is in their law firm. And then another healthy percentage implied that it wasn't important or that they have no idea how to even begin to calculate the cost per lead. We believe this is a critical gap in a vast majority of law firms today who are investing online, whether it be in advertising or marketing. We also see it as a huge advantage to the law firms who are in fact tracking this data, because the ones who are tracking it are ultimately able to make better uh, data-driven decisions on behalf of their marketing to allow them to continue to get better and better and exponentially better compared to their counterparts, those of which who are not tracking cost per lead. Another interesting stat, to take this a little bit further, we also asked who was tracking cost per case. And probably not much to surprise here. Uh, the answer is pretty similar. 41% reported no, they do not track cost per case in their law firm. And another healthy percentage implied not important and they had no idea how to calculate it. Only 20% of the market right now is actively tracking cost per case from their marketing. Again, huge opportunity, huge advantage for the firms who are in fact doing this. So the real question is, what's the gap? What's the gap in measurement? I think all too often we're looking at things in a vacuum as marketers. And we tend to see things as more global or holistic. And in many instances, they are. They all work together synergistically. But if you're not tracking individual components of your marketing and evaluating how successful one is against another, you're never going to be able to have enough insights to make the important decisions needed to continue to distance yourself from competition. We believe that key marketing lanes, if you will, come down to brand building marketing efforts and sales activation advertising efforts. So let's break down the two. Now, this is not based on ConsultWeb studies. This is based on a pretty exhaustive, I believe it was over a 30-year study done by Les Binet and Peter Field, where they looked at a number of large advertising entities, mostly enterprise companies, and they produced this phenomenal amount of research around what they call the long and short of it, basically identifying where firms are investing dollars, whether it be toward brand advertising and building versus sales activation, and evaluating how that ultimately impacted their bottom line, their profitability. And you can break these down. Brand building is much more of it's working toward establishing recognition, building trust around your brand and your marketplace. What it does is it absolutely influences buyer behavior or future sales. It allows you to cast a much broader reach. Naturally, there's only a small percentage of people who need your services at any given time. But as a law firm, you have a much wider potential client base. They're just not actively seeking legal representation at that time. It certainly helps to go ahead and proactively get your brand in front of those individuals at an early stage in order to be top of mind when they do in fact need you. Brand building is lost, unfortunately, on a lot of law firms because they tend to see it as a race, and we'll get to that point in a moment. But that's why a lot of law firms tend to lean more towards sales activation initiatives. These are things that ultimately work to generate action now. In many instances, it has a strong call to action at the end of the advertisement or whatever it is that you're using to generate the sales. And it's much more focused on short-term gains. Certainly not a bad thing by any means, but it's important to understand the differences and the synergies between the two, ultimately in an effort to make the best decisions going forward for your marketing. Ultimately, the way you can look at it is brand building or brand initiatives help to support your long-term business. It's not, or rarely ever will these brand building initiatives drive a ton of revenue into your law firm all at once. This is much more a year's strategy, multi-year strategy, as opposed to short-term activation efforts. A lot of times it's weeks, if not just a few months, and usually it has a light at the end of the tunnel. There is an end game toward these sales activation efforts, and then you start again. You do another one, and so they absolutely work together, but they have two very different long-term games and short-term games when comparing one another. Just to give you some practical examples on what platforms or marketing efforts would fit into each category. Search engine optimization is absolutely a long-term brand building and exposure effort that builds on itself over time. You can see the screenshot example there implying that long-term growth. When you get into more mass tort generation or any lead generation type strategies, there's really not a ton of value long term. It's moving more into the short term efforts, and then you can really get into the sales activation efforts when you get into like pay per click with Google Ads or local service ads. These are direct response. You throw money at it today and you hope to get a return back, or at least a signed client back tomorrow. That's ultimately the effort toward the short term. Again, both important, but it's a matter of where and how you're allocating those investment dollars. It ultimately comes down to tracking, and that's why we stress measurement. This is not a new a topic for ConsultWebs, because we have learned in working with law firms since 1999, there is huge value in being able to track cost per lead and cost per case for any individual marketing effort, so that you can ultimately identify what's sitting in a healthy threshold or benchmark in terms of cost per lead and cost per case, and what's red flagged, meaning it's exceeded the comfortable threshold. You need to make important decisions, either disbanding that campaign or reallocating investment dollars. If you're not tracking that data, you have no tools to be able to leverage in order to make better decisions going forward. Regardless of what dashboard or how you're systematically tracking this, I really don't care how it's being done, as long as it's being done. There are phenomenal, very robust platforms out there and software that you can leverage and track this with more automation. And then we know of some firms that successfully track it in an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't matter as long as it's being done. And in fact, once you start doing it, you're going to learn and you're going to continue to evolve that process to be even more efficient internally. The next piece would be the investments concept. Where and how are you applying those investment dollars in order to see optimal returns? All too often, we see firms throwing dollars pretty much anywhere there's an opportunity. In many instances, they're throwing dollars in places where there are no prospective clients to be found. This is a perfect illustration. This image here gives you the idea that there are a lot of firms throwing dollars in billboards where very few potential clients are passing by or taking action. The same is true online. You can be investing in a directory $1,000 or more a month, and very rarely getting referral traffic, and even more so rarely getting viable leads from that. You need to know where those dollars are going, making sure that they're in front of the right candidates. And again, going back to the measurement piece, if you're tracking it effectively, you are able to determine the true value of any individual marketing piece, whether it be brand or sales activation efforts. Going back to this long study by Les Binet and Peter Field around ultimately the perfect balance, the marketing balance for a business, we've ultimately determined that for law firms, we believe there is a healthy balance between the two. Les Binet and Peter Field ultimately determined that 60% of your marketing spend should be going into brand building efforts, whereas approximately 40% of your investment dollars should be going into sales activation. We realize that every firm is in a different spot. You may be in hyper growth mode. You may be well established and you're not investing a significant amount of marketing and more just riding the brand value. I realize you could be in two very different stages as a business. But that being said, that's a good place to start in terms of an investment breakdown. 60% of your dollars going toward brand building, 40% into sales activation. And let's walk through that. By the way, we have a tremendous resource online. If you just search in Google ConsultWebs Nutrition Guide, you should be able to find this resource pretty quickly, and you'll find shortly how it's interactive, but you can use it as a tool to quickly identify where your dollars are being allocated online. But what's interesting, I want to point out this study that Les Binet and Peter Field did, and when they compared these firms over the course of 3 decades, they identified that sales activation efforts rarely ever allowed for these like viral wins where they would just see an immediate spike in new business. But what they did find, it was relatively consistent, but it always maxed out, meaning there was an end or a cap to the value and the results. Once it ended, it went back down, and it was a constant rinse and repeat type effort that rarely ever gained tremendous trajectory long term. And you flip that around and you compare that to brand building initiatives, and you can see that while it started off slow and the sales or the revenue came very well, I guess consistently fell short comparing to sales activation efforts over time, approximately beyond 6 months, that's when brand building began to take off and produce extremely more results and productivity, as well as return on investment long term. And so the argument came down that these should not be seen as vacuums or invested in vacuums, meaning you should never look at it from the consideration of choosing one or the other. the perfect scenario is finding a good balance between the two and making sure that you can keep your lights on in the short term, in the first 6 months or so of advertising aggressively, but ultimately that you're building yourself up for the long term to see tremendously more gains and return on investment in your marketing and advertising dollars, and ultimately making good decisions in the short and the long term. That's what this study's about, and that's ultimately what this information is leading law firms to help them make these better decisions. We broke down this resource, as mentioned. If you go to Google and type in ConsultWeb's nutrition guide, certainly if you respond to this webinar, we can send this link to you as well. But they break down the concepts of marketing and advertising all the way from the top level of brand growth down to sales activation, and giving very specific examples for each category. The foundation piece is something I want to point out because it's not just a dollar for dollar type marketing initiative. Sometimes these are much more process driven. And what you see first and foremost is client experience. I think all too often law firms think and prioritize marketing over processes and intake, whereas I would argue that intake is critical. It is critical to your future success, regardless of whether you're marketing or not, but even more so important if you are marketing and driving leads into the door. What is that first impression that you're delivering? Are you collecting all the necessary information? Are you building confidence in that first call? And are you maximizing the number of leads into signed cases from that effort? That's foundational. That's going to support your brand both short term and long term, and something you should take very seriously. As you move down the next one here, nutrients, that's when we get into like what we mentioned earlier, search engine optimization, or your design itself. Today, obviously, the vast majority of users are coming into your site on a mobile device. You want to make sure that that mobile site is rock solid from a usability standpoint, from a load speed standpoint. It needs to be able to build trust and confidence and drive leads. That's something that's going to benefit your brand long term. It's going to stick with those users, and hopefully they'll be reminded of that in the future if and when they need your services again, or if and when a family member or friend need your services. Those are all aspects, again, that support the long-term efficacy of your law firm. Continuing to move down the list, you get into more one-time type initiatives, things that are start and stop, scholarships, event marketing, sponsorships. Those are all examples of initiatives that you jump in, you make a splash, and you tend to allow it just to kind of slowly die out over time, or you have a very solid stop date on that type of initiative. That's getting into the more sales activation efforts. Again, extremely helpful, very good for law firms, but you don't want all of your eggs in that sales activation basket because it's ultimately diluting your long-term success as a marketer. Going back to a survey that we pushed out to lawyers across the country, we asked if they had a legal marketing strategy that combined both this brand growth and sales activation. This study is not a new study that we've been talking about. This is a study that's been in place for decades at this point. But all too often, business owners, including law firms, have no idea. They've never seen this study, nor do they know the validity behind it and the major impact it can make on the long-term success of a business. All too often, I mentioned earlier, lawyers see this as a race. All they're trying to do from the moment they walk into their office is sprint. We all get caught up in it. We're all guilty of it. But if we can stop and consider the long term versus the short term, we can make so much better decisions for our business. And ultimately, yes, still treat certain efforts as a race because they certainly are. It's hyper competitive in the legal field, but there's also initiatives that we can work toward, we can invest in that don't necessarily drive business tomorrow, but secures our future, secures our market share over the next several years. This is another example of a long-term, this is actually an SEO campaign of a client, and you can see the rankings progress over time. This is a long-term play. If a firm was only going to jump in and test search engine optimization for the first 3 to 6 months, in most instances, they're rarely, if ever, going to see return on investment. They have to approach this with a long-term mindset, and you need to do that for all brand building initiatives. Commit to it, make sure that it's a solid idea for the business, and continue it. Don't allow things to force you to pivot unless they are truly significant enough, to cause you to restructure your long-term business growth plans. You will find huge value long-term in being able to invest in these brand building initiatives, but you need to come to it with the expectation that it's not going to produce results overnight. So that's ultimately where we identify that gap in investment. Law firms are all too often focused so heavily on these quick hitting sales activation efforts that they're neglecting the long-term brand. If you intend to be in business over the next 3 to 6+ years, I strongly encourage you to be applying a portion of your marketing spend into these brand building initiatives. Again, ideally 60%, but if you're nowhere near that, you may need to take baby steps toward reallocating dollars into strengthening the long-term brand awareness of the firm. A couple points. I mentioned that resource. If you go online and find it, it gets more interactive and allowing you to ultimately pull the dial here back and forth based on where you're applying marketing dollars, whether it's very little dollars going here or tons of money going here. It'll ultimately give you that percentage breakdown. And you can have those discussions with your marketing provider. If you have a marketing consultant, talk through that with them and identify, are there needed changes that we need to make to our marketing portfolio? Just like hiring an investment advisor, they don't just set it up initially and then walk away from it, never to come back to it. They come back to it regularly, ideally to identify where are your gains, where are your losses, and where do we need to reallocate dollars based on where we see the future going. This is so important and needs to keep your attention, not just every year, but I would encourage you every single quarter to take time thinking through this important information. Identify the gap, make better decisions for your firm, and I can assure you that's what's ultimately going to lead to better results for the firm and naturally lead to a higher degree of confidence in your marketing, confidence in the long-term success of your business. What's interesting is that the other concept of confidence doesn't necessarily lean toward the idea of, should I invest here or should I invest there? And do I feel good about my investments? That's one degree of confidence, absolutely. But the other side of this is, do you have a high degree of confidence in the message, in the brand that you're portraying to the marketplace? What's really interesting is that we've gotten some conflicting data back from law firms. When we did the study here with these law firms, we asked, do you feel if advertising and marketing cheapens a law firm? A little over half reported no, but there was still a healthy percentage saying yes and that it depends. When we dove into a study done by the Florida Bar back in 2017, they asked ultimately if what their perception was or what they've believed advertising did to impact the public's view of lawyers and the overall legal profession. Interestingly enough, a large percentage, in fact, over 80% that were surveyed, implied that yes, it does negatively impact how the public perceives lawyers and the legal profession. It's a sad data point. What's even more interesting is that the follow-up question asked specifically whether advertising law firms, the ones who were putting dollars on a monthly basis into advertising their brand, if they felt like that negatively impacted public perception. Astonishingly, 81% still believed, yes, it negatively influences public perception. That's a bad thing. And that's because there's a lack of confidence in the marketing message, in what you're portraying to the public. Now, that very well could be other advertising firms that have potentially gone maybe a little too far in their messaging to the public, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But our concern is that if there's a lack of confidence on behalf of the law firms, the true, credible, trustworthy, experienced law firms, then we're pushing the wrong message overall to the marketplace. That's hurting your business long term. You ultimately need to find a way to build that confidence up so that you can, in fact, put dollars behind it with confidence and be happy, be pleased with the message that's being pushed to the public around your brand. All of these advertising, or all the ones who responded to this survey by the Florida Bar, reported that the bulk of dollars being invested toward marketing is going into the internet. This was in 2017, so I'm confident that's continued to grow, where the internet has outpaced virtually any other marketing and advertising platform out there. And that's important to note. And specifically looking at websites and what messaging that those law firms are portraying. So looking at the gap of confidence, where is the gap? We believe that the gap ultimately comes down to firms not willing to be creative, not willing to tell their story and truly distance themselves or separate themselves from the marketplace through true unique value proposition or differentiation. The problem is that when most firms or even the public think of advertising lawyers, they immediately think of the firms who have invested serious dollars into a serious brand. And in some instances, maybe a serious brand doesn't always correlate to a trustworthy brand. Two can be very, very different. But at the end of the day, these firms have a high degree of confidence in that their message, their marketing angle is unique enough to blast out to the marketplace and attract attention. And in most instances, they're highly successful at doing that because they started with the confidence of separating themselves, of standing apart. The sad piece is that when you think of great advertising, you rarely think safety and standards. When you see a viral video, be it for a law firm or any other business, very rarely did that business start with thinking conservatively on their advertising. Very rarely were they thinking safety and standards. The problem is that when you begin to pay or invest in advertising or brand building, you're almost always about safety and standards. You're thinking too much and saying the wrong thing or not portraying your brand appropriately. By no means do I feel that's not important. I do believe it's extremely important to be conscientious of your brand, make sure that it tells your story. But once you've gone through the process of identifying your true unique value proposition, be confident in pushing that message out and also be intentional about pushing that message out in a way that's both focused on brand building long term and also focused simultaneously on driving leads in the short term. Work to couple those investment scenarios so that they're working for you and they're ultimately going to position your business for an optimal growth rate and success. We want to give you some practical ways to stand out. ConsultWebs has done this through a number of ways. Content marketing is a big play behind it. Certainly messaging is what we've talked about, but standing out with confidence can simply come down to just unique assets, unique resources on your website. We've done that for a number of clients. Basically, any kind of open source data that tells a story, we can visually represent on the site and illustrate why you're different, why you're unique in the marketplace, and help you stand out both short term and long term. And we've done this through a number of topics. We obviously have the holidays coming up. There's an opportunity to invest in the community and ultimately position your brand alongside a goodwill initiative in the marketplace. It's tremendous for long-term brand building and a great way to differentiate the business. There are endless ideas out there. Ultimately, it comes down to who you are as a business, who you're helping, and how ultimately you can help those individuals with information or resources in the meantime, even when they're not actively seeking legal representation, so that you've established that brand awareness when they do need help. Hopefully this information has been useful to you. It's what we've found and what we've proven to be the ingredients needed to bridge the gap. You need to focus on measurement, know your cost per lead, know your cost per case, work with your marketing providers to be accountable to that data and use that data to guide future decisions. When it comes to the investments, make sure that that portfolio is diversified. Use a tool like what we mentioned earlier about the nutrition guide, making sure that you have an appropriate amount supporting the long-term brand of the business as well as supporting the short-term sales activations. And lastly, be confident to stand out. I'll leave you with this. The distance between dreams and reality is called action. It takes action. You have to take the steps toward that end result in order to show progress. And I can assure you, even if you don't master it, even if you're not perfect, taking the steps we've talked about today will allow you to see growth and future success. I'm sure of it. If we can be of future help, if we can offer any answers to questions related to this topic or anything related to digital marketing for law firms, we're always happy to help.